In the summer of 1954, a 51-year-old milkshake machine salesman drove into San Bernardino, California, on a sales call he almost did not make. His name was Ray Kroc. His knees ached from years on the road. He had been diagnosed with diabetes. His gallbladder was gone. He was selling a product that fewer and fewer restaurants wanted, in a career that had never quite matched the size of what he believed he was capable of. By every reasonable measure, the story of Ray Kroc was already written. Middle-aged salesman. Decent living. Nothing remarkable. And then he walked through the door of a small hamburger stand on the corner of 14th and E Street and stopped. Not because the burgers smelled good. Not because the place was busy, though it was. But because in 30 seconds of watching that kitchen operate, Ray Kroc saw something that every other businessman who had walked past that building had completely missed. Something that, in that moment, he could not fully explain, but that he knew, with a certainty he had not felt about anything in years, was the most important thing he had ever seen in his life. Think about what it feels like to be 51 years old and still waiting for the thing that was supposed to define you. Not with bitterness. Ray Kroc was not a bitter man, but with the specific, quiet weight of a person who has always believed the best of what he could build was still ahead of him, and has spent decades unable to prove it to anyone, including himself. He had tried piano. He had sold paper cups. He had worked as a radio DJ. He had spent the better part of 2 decades driving from restaurant to restaurant across America with a sample case and a sales pitch, watching other people build things while he sold them equipment. His wife thought it was time to slow down. His body was sending the same message. And the industry he had spent his career in was shrinking around him. But Ray Kroc drove to San Bernardino anyway. And what he found inside that hamburger stand was not just a business opportunity. It was the answer to a question he had been carrying for 30 years. What he could not have known, standing in that kitchen watching 2 brothers named Richard and Maurice McDonald produce hamburgers with a speed and consistency he had never seen before, was that he was not looking at their idea. He was looking at his life's work. Everything he had learned from 30 years of watching restaurants succeed and fail, everything he understood about what American customers wanted and what the industry was not yet giving them, everything he had absorbed from decades of being on the road and paying attention, it was all sitting in that kitchen, waiting for the one person who could see it clearly enough to take it everywhere. Ray Kroc was 51 years old, and the most important chapter of his life had not started yet. Before we go further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if stories like this move you, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we uncover next on The Silent Fortunes. His name was Ray Kroc. And before we go any further into what he built, let us be honest about what he was at the moment this story begins. He was not a young entrepreneur with venture capital and a business plan. He was not a seasoned executive with a track record that commanded respect in boardrooms. He was a 51-year-old milkshake machine salesman from Illinois, driving a territory that was getting smaller every year, with bad knees, early-stage diabetes, and a body that had logged more miles on American highways than most men his age would ever want to count. The people who knew Ray Kroc in 1954, his wife, his colleagues, the restaurant owners who bought his machines and chatted with him over coffee, would have described him as a good man, a hard worker, a decent salesman. Not one of them would have described him as someone who was about to change the way 300 million Americans eat. So how does a man like that, with that resume, in that condition, at that age, go on to build the most recognized food brand in the history of the world? What did Ray Kroc see inside that small hamburger stand on the corner of 14th and E Street in San Bernardino, California, that every other businessman who had driven past it, walked past it, or eaten inside it had completely failed to recognize? And what did it actually cost him? Not in the clean, summarized version of the story that most people have heard, but in the real version. The financial pressure, the personal sacrifice, the physical toll of building something at an age when most men are planning for less, not more. Those are the questions at the center of this story. And by the time you have the answers, you will never again look at a man in his 50s with a modest resume and a large ambition and assume you already know how his story ends. Ray Kroc was born on October 5, 1902, in Oak Park, Illinois, a modest suburb of Chicago where working-class families built quiet, careful lives, and ambition was something you learned to keep to a manageable size. He grew up in a home that understood the value of a dollar and the necessity of work, But Ray Kroc never quite absorbed the part about keeping ambition manageable. From an early age, he carried a sense that he was meant for something larger than what was immediately visible around him. Not arrogance, not entitlement, but a genuine and persistent conviction that the right opportunity was somewhere ahead of him, and that the work between here and there was simply the price of finding it. At 15 years old, before he had finished high school, he lied about his age to join the Red Cross as an ambulance driver during World War I. The war ended before he reached the front lines, but the decision itself told you something about the kind of man Ray Kroc was going to be. Someone who moved toward things rather than waiting to be invited. The years that followed were a long education in the distance between ambition and outcome. Ray Kroc played piano in small bands and restaurants through the early 1920s, good enough to work, but not good enough to become anything lasting. He moved into sales, working for the Lily Tulip Cup Company selling paper cups to restaurants and food service operations across the Midwest, a job that taught him an enormous amount about how restaurants operated, what made them succeed, and what made their owners think the way they thought. He worked briefly as a radio DJ in Chicago. He tried several other ventures that went nowhere in particular. By the time he reached his late 30s and early 40s, Ray Kroc had accumulated a deep and genuinely useful understanding of the American food service industry, and almost nothing else to show for the decades he had spent acquiring it. Then he found the Prince Castle multi-mixer. It was a machine that could blend 5 milkshakes simultaneously, and Ray Kroc believed in it with the kind of enthusiasm that only a natural salesman can sustain for a product most people find unremarkable. He became the exclusive sales agent for the multi-mixer and spent the 1940s and early 1950s building a territory, driving from restaurant to restaurant across America, demonstrating the machine, closing deals, building relationships with owners and managers who came to know his face and his pitch. It was honest work and it paid reasonably well. But by the time Ray Kroc reached his early 50s, the honest truth was that the work was taking more out of him than it was giving back. His knees had been ground down by decades of travel. He had been diagnosed with early-stage diabetes. His gallbladder had been removed. The multi-mixer business was facing increasing competition, and the territory that had once felt full of possibility was beginning to feel like a ceiling. And then, in the summer of 1954, a single order arrived that made no sense. A small hamburger stand in San Bernardino, California had ordered not one multi-mixer, not 2, but 8. Enough to produce 40 simultaneous milkshakes. For a restaurant that size, in a town that small, that number was almost impossible to explain. Ray Kroc had to see it for himself. The life Ray Kroc was living in the early 1950s was not a bad life, by most reasonable measures. He had a wife, a home in Arlington Heights, Illinois, an income that covered the basics and occasionally a little more. But reasonable measures were never the standard Ray Kroc had set for himself, and the distance between where he was and where he had always believed he was going to end up had become, by his early 50s, a weight he carried every single day without ever fully setting it down. He had watched other men build things while he sold them equipment. He had watched ideas he understood better than the people implementing them get executed badly, by people with less knowledge and less instinct than he had, in front of opportunities he had seen first and acted on too slowly or not at all. The talent was there. The knowledge was there. The ambition had never left. What had never arrived was the thing that turns all of those qualities into something the world can actually see and measure. What the world around Ray Kroc saw in the early 1950s was straightforward. A middle-aged salesman, good at his job, past the age when most successful men had made their defining moves, working a territory that was producing less than it once had. His wife Ethel was quietly practical about what their life was and what it was likely to remain. His colleagues in the industry knew him as a reliable presence and a decent closer, not as someone who was building towards something. There was no cruelty in any of this. It was simply the honest assessment of people who looked at the available evidence and drew the most reasonable conclusion. And the most reasonable conclusion, looking at Ray Kroc in 1953 or early 1954, was that the story was largely written. Not a failure, not a tragedy, just a man who had worked hard and ended up somewhere modest, the way most men do. What none of them could see, what Ray Kroc himself could feel but not yet articulate, was the thing that had been building in him across 30 years of watching the American food service industry from the inside. The specific, accumulated, hard-won understanding of what made a restaurant work and what made it fail. The instinct for what customers actually wanted versus what owners thought they wanted. The vision for what was possible if someone took the friction out of the dining experience and made quality consistent and speed reliable at a price ordinary Americans could afford every day of the week. None of that was visible from the outside. None of that showed up on a sales territory report. And then the order came in from San Bernardino. 8 multi-mixers for a single hamburger stand. And Ray Kroc looked at that number and felt something he had not felt in years. Curiosity that had teeth in it. The particular alertness of a man who has been waiting for something without knowing exactly what it looks like, and has just seen something that might be it. And just when it seemed like there was no way out, something shifted. Ray Kroc drove to San Bernardino in the summer of 1954 expecting to see a busy hamburger stand. What he found when he arrived at the corner of 14th and E Street stopped him before he had fully walked through the door. The line of customers stretched out of the building and into the parking lot. Not at lunchtime, not during a special event, but in the middle of an ordinary California afternoon. He watched the operation from outside for a few minutes before going in, trying to understand what he was seeing. The food came out in seconds, not minutes. Every customer received exactly what they ordered, prepared identically, at a price, 15 cents for a hamburger. That made stopping there not a decision, but a reflex. Richard and Maurice McDonald had created something that Ray Kroc had never seen in 30 years of walking through restaurant kitchens across America. A system so precisely designed and so efficiently executed that the quality did not depend on who was working that day or how experienced they were. It just worked. Every time. For every customer. Without variation. What Ray Kroc understood in that kitchen, watching the McDonald brothers' speedy service system operate, was something that the brothers themselves had never fully thought through. They had built a perfect machine for their corner of San Bernardino. They were comfortable. They were profitable. They had already tried franchising on a small scale and found it more trouble than it was worth, because every new location drifted from the original system and the quality degraded. What Ray Kroc saw, what his 30 years of watching restaurants succeed and fail had equipped him to see more clearly than almost anyone else alive, was that the problem was not the concept. The problem was that nobody had yet figured out how to replicate the system with the same precision that Richard and Maurice had built into the original. And Ray Kroc believed, with the complete and immediate certainty of a man who has spent decades preparing for a moment without knowing it, that he was the person who could figure that out. He sat down with Richard and Maurice McDonald and proposed something they had heard before and rejected before, national franchising. But Ray Kroc was not proposing what previous franchise attempts had offered. He was proposing something more specific and more demanding, a system in which every franchisee would operate the restaurant exactly as the original was operated, with no deviation, no shortcuts, and no compromises on the food or the process. The McDonald brothers were skeptical. They were doing well. They did not need the complication. But Ray Kroc was persistent in the way that only a man who has been waiting for something for 30 years can be persistent, not aggressive, not pressuring, but completely and quietly immovable. In 1954, they signed an agreement making Ray Kroc their exclusive franchise agent for the United States. He was 51 years old. He had found his life's work. And the most important thing he understood about it, the thing that the McDonald brothers never fully grasped and that most people who tell this story skip over entirely, was that he was not building a restaurant business. He was building a system business. And the difference between those two things is the difference between one successful hamburger stand in San Bernardino and 40,000 locations in over 100 countries. On April 15, 1955, Ray Kroc opened the first McDonald's franchise he personally operated, in Des Plaines, Illinois, a Chicago suburb he had chosen deliberately because he wanted to prove the concept could work in the Midwest, not just in the warm weather and car culture of Southern California. He was 52 years old. He stood in that parking lot on opening day and watched customers pull in, and the system that he had studied and refined and believed in delivered exactly what he had promised it would deliver: fast, consistent, affordable food that made people want to come back. The first day's sales were $366.12. It was not a fortune, but it was proof. And proof was what Ray Kroc had been working toward for 30 years. What followed was not a clean upward trajectory. The financial reality of those early years was genuinely brutal in ways that most versions of this story smooth over. Ray Kroc was not a wealthy man when he began franchising McDonald's. He was a salesman who had signed a franchise agreement that gave him a very thin margin on each location's revenue, leaving him almost nothing to work with after expenses. He borrowed against everything he had. He personally guaranteed loans that put his home and his financial security at risk. He went years without drawing a meaningful salary from the business he was building. His accountant, Harry Sonneborn, who later became McDonald's first president, told Kroc directly that McDonald's was not in the food business. It was in the real estate business, because the only way to make the numbers work was to own the land under the franchises rather than simply collecting fees from them. Kroc listened. He restructured the entire business model around real estate ownership, and that single strategic shift became the financial foundation that made everything else possible. The tension with Richard and Maurice McDonald grew steadily as the business grew. The brothers had never wanted an empire. They wanted a comfortable, well-run operation that provided them a good life in San Bernardino. Every time Ray Kroc wanted to expand the menu, adjust the system, or make changes that would strengthen the brand nationally, he ran into the terms of his original agreement, which gave the brothers significant control. The frustration built for years until 1961, when Ray Kroc negotiated the purchase of the McDonald's name, the brand, and all associated rights from Richard and Maurice McDonald for $2.7 million, a sum he had to borrow in its entirety because he did not have it. That same year, he founded Hamburger University in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, a training facility dedicated entirely to teaching franchisees the McDonald's system with the same precision and consistency that the original San Bernardino operation had operated. The message of Hamburger University was the same message Ray Kroc had been delivering since 1954. The system is everything, and the system does not bend. By the time Ray Kroc died on January 14, 1984, McDonald's was operating in dozens of countries, serving millions of customers every single day, and had become the most recognized food brand on earth. The 51-year-old milkshake machine salesman with bad knees and a shrinking territory had built something that had never existed before in the history of American business. Today, McDonald's operates more than 40,000 locations in over 100 countries and serves approximately 69 million customers every single day. 69 million people. Every single day. Built from a 15-cent hamburger in a parking lot in San Bernardino, California, by a 51-year-old milkshake machine salesman who most people in his life had already quietly stopped expecting great things from. It is one of the most recognized brands in the history of human commerce. And almost everything about how it came to exist traces back to one man's decision to drive to California on a sales call he was curious enough to make. So what do we take from the life of Ray Kroc? What are the silent fortunes buried inside this story? The first silent fortune is this. It is never the idea that builds the empire. It is the system. Richard and Maurice McDonald had the idea. They created the speedy service system. They built the original restaurant and proved the concept worked beautifully in one specific location in San Bernardino. And they were content to leave it there. Ray Kroc took the same idea and built a system around it so precise, so replicable, and so relentlessly standardized that it could be executed identically by franchisees in Illinois, in Texas, in Japan, and in 100 other countries without the quality changing. The idea was the spark. The system was the fire. If you are sitting on an idea right now that has never become what you believed it could become, the question Ray Kroc's story asks you is not whether the idea is good enough. It is whether you have built a system around it that can survive without you standing in the room. The second silent fortune is this. The best opportunities in your life will arrive disguised as ordinary sales calls. Ray Kroc was not looking for McDonald's. He was not searching for his life's work. He was driving to San Bernardino to understand why one small hamburger stand had ordered 8 milkshake machines. He found what he found because he was still paying attention at 51, still curious, still willing to drive the extra miles, still asking why instead of assuming he already knew. The opportunity was not announced. It was not obvious. It was sitting on a street corner in a California town that most people had never heard of, visible only to someone who had spent 30 years developing the specific knowledge required to recognize it. The opportunities that change your life almost never look like opportunities when they arrive. They look like curiosity worth following. And the third silent fortune, the one that matters most to every man watching this, is this. Your early 50s are not the closing chapter. Ray Kroc was 51 years old when he walked into that hamburger stand. He was 52 when he opened his first franchise in Des Plaines, Illinois. He was 59 years old when he purchased McDonald's outright from the brothers for $2.7 million. Every single thing Ray Kroc is remembered for, every location, every system, every customer served, every dollar generated, happened after the age at which most men have already decided that their defining contribution is behind them. If you are watching this in your 40s, your 50s, or your 60s and carrying the quiet fear that the best of what you can build has already happened, Ray Kroc's story is the most direct answer to that fear that American business history has ever produced. The answer is no. It has not happened yet. In the summer of 1954, a 51-year-old milkshake machine salesman with bad knees and a shrinking territory drove to San Bernardino, California on a sales call he almost did not make. He walked through the door of a small hamburger stand, watched a kitchen operate for 30 seconds, and understood something that changed the direction of everything that came after. Not because he was young, not because he was wealthy, not because the world had given him any particular reason to expect that the defining chapter of his life was still ahead of him, but because Ray Kroc had spent 30 years paying attention, and he was still paying attention on the day it finally mattered most. So here is the question I want to leave you with today, and I want you to answer it honestly in the comments below. Ray Kroc was 51 years old when he found the opportunity that changed everything. How old are you right now? And what opportunity might you be driving past, walking past, or dismissing as just another ordinary moment? Because you have already decided, quietly and without fully admitting it, that your best chapter is behind you. Tell me honestly in the comments below. If Ray Kroc's story gave you something today, a perspective, a reason to stay curious, a push to keep paying attention, subscribe to the Silent Fortunes. Because every single week we come back here and uncover another story the world forgot to tell.